So on the one hand, it seems like he was very childlike, almost sort of silly, giggling, inane, unintelligent. And then on the other hand, there appears to be a cold, calculating and cruel side. Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. Martin Bryant is an enigma, to say the least. By all accounts, Martin, growing up in the community of Port Arthur, was ostracised. He was regarded as not being very intelligent, of having social issues like aggression, was reported to be cruel at times to animals, and that he later on, as he grew into adulthood, exhibited, signs of aggression and potentially dangerous threats with firearms and so on. The other side to Martin, and there are many photographs that also indicate this, is that he loved animals. There is a picture of him cuddling a koala. He used to ride horses. He was concerned about shooting in the bush and leaving broken glass in case it hurt animals. So it sort of flies in the face of the reports that came out in some of the books that have been written about Martin, that he was cruel to animals and tortured them. There was some report that he had crushed a pet lizard. So there seems to be a bit of a dichotomy between the nature of Martin. So on the one hand, it seems like he was very childlike, almost sort of silly, giggling, inane, unintelligent. And then on the other hand, there appears to be a cold, calculating and cruel side, which you would imagine then the latter would predispose someone to conduct some kind of homicidal criminal activity if it went to an extreme length. Attached to all of these podcasts will be the files for your own perusal. I've examined all of the medical diagnosis reports that I can get my hands on, including some that were given to me when Martin was in Risdon prison. Trying to determine his mental state, what condition he may or may not have had. The bottom line is that they're very nebulous. There are some doctors that suggest that he had schizophrenia. There are others that said they don't think he had schizophrenia. Martin at one point was taking medication at the time for schizophrenia that clearly states you should not take this medication if you don't have schizophrenia, which perhaps may have influenced behavioural traits. If there was like two Martin Bryants, the innocent, giggling Martin Bryant, the child Martin Bryant, and the evil, sadistic killer Martin Bryant, then that would be suggestive of dual personality or a multiple personality disorder, which he has never been clinically diagnosed with. For someone to carry out something as monstrous as Port Arthur and to, as some reports have said, laugh about it, be frivolous about it, there would be an indication of a sociopathy or psychopathy. That has also never been diagnosed formally. If Martin was a sociopath, as we know, sociopaths can be charming, they're good liars, and they're very clever and very calculating and very cunning, and they get their own way. So they can deceive people. So if some of the behaviour of Martin Bryant was designed to play the innocent in order to divert attention away from his other side, then that would be sociopathy. but once again hasn't been diagnosed. So Martin has, over the years, seen a barrage of psychologists and psychiatrists, both prior to Port Arthur and since the crime. But to this date, no one has comprehensively determined his mental state. He was examined in 1984 when he was a teenager by Dr. Cunningham Dax, who's a very renowned psychiatrist who came to Australia from England in 1969 to continue his research into deep sleep hypnosis and the effects of mass trauma on the civilian population, because Tasmania presented a perfect environment for him to continue those studies. He evaluated Martin Bryant in 1984 and basically communicated to Martin's parents, Carleen and Maurice, that Martin was of diminished IQ, had basically a very bad social ineptitude, and that he would not be able to really function in society, and suggested that the best thing he could do is go on welfare. They were fairly upset at that, given that Martin was 16 at the time. And they mentioned, his mother mentioned his schizophrenia, and the Dr. Cunningham Dax replied, well, it's not as simple as that. So did Martin have schizophrenia? Did he have multiple personality disorder? Was he a sociopath? Was he just an unintelligent person who had a grudge? Once again, a lot of it is confusing, and it's fairly inconclusive. I would personally think that since the crime and the fact that he's been interned for 30-something years, that he should really be examined forensically, specifically with the idea of referring to the crime itself, to get some kind of background as to motivation, his mental state at the time, whether he was taking medication. Martin used to drink a lot as well. So all of those factors would determine the behaviour of someone. Martin had lost his father to suicide, but by all reports he had a fairly loving, normal family upbringing. Carleen Bryant, his mother, in her book My Story, she talked about that they were, in essence, they had their problems, that Martin was a problem child, but that they had a normal family life. So he is a bit of a mystery. I'll mention once again that the reason I call my intended film Wasp, the Port Arthur Massacre, Wasp suggests an ambiguity of motive, because the shooter on the way down to the site stopped to help two girls whose car had broken down by the side of the road. They saw the surfboard on his car and said, "Are you going surfing?" And he said, "No, I'm going down to the Isle of the Dead to get rid of some wasps," which was a strange thing to say. And that while the shooter was down at Broadara Cafe, he sat at the table and began waving his hands around and complaining that there were wasps, but then mentioned not too many Jap tourists quite loudly and offensively. So later on in a police interview, Martin was asked, do you have any understanding of the term wasp other than European wasps? Martin replied no, meaning, of course, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And he did say, "I'm allergic to bee stings, though I almost died when I was a kid." And there were reports by witnesses there were European wasps at the Broadara Cafe. So the ambiguity of motive with Martin Bryant is an unusual one. Someone who would go down there to get rid of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants definitely has a slightly ideological agenda that suggests a higher intelligence, whereas somebody who's afraid of getting stung by a bee is a child. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. Feel free to share far and wide and see the attached files in support of the episode. Thank you.